These anterior and posterior rootlets will fuse together like this, and this here form the anterior root and posterior root. Okay, so this, for example, all of this posterior root. The anterior and posterior roots will combine, and then they will form the spinal nerve. Okay, the spinal nerve. So anterior, posterior rootlets, anterior, posterior roots join together, spinal nerve. The posterior root has like a little expansion here, like a little spherical shape here. That's called the posterior root ganglion. Posterior root ganglion. Okay, so here the spinal nerve, due to fusion of the two anterior and posterior roots, the spinal nerve then gives off two branches. Well, there's more than that. We'll just focus on the two first. One goes forward to supply the front of the body and the sides of the body, and one goes back to supply the back of the body. Everything in the back. It depends on which level of the spinal cord you're looking at, but there is one that goes to supply front and sides, one the back. So this is called anterior primary ramus, posterior primary ramus. This here I'm showing again. So this here is the anterior rootlets, form the anterior root. Posterior rootlets on the back form posterior root. Posterior root will have this expansion that's called posterior root ganglion. Anterior and posterior root combine to form the spinal nerve, and the spinal nerve will give a branch that goes back, the posterior primary ramus, and front, forward, anteriorly, anterior primary ramus. Here you can see the denticulate ligament. The denticulate ligament you can see is found between anterior rootlets or anterior root and posterior rootlets, posterior root. Okay, between them. It is also found between within spinal nerves that vertically, so like this. Okay, so it's not only found between anterior and posterior roots, it's also found separate between the entire spinal nerve here and the adjacent spinal nerve. I hope you understand what I'm trying to show you here. Finally, if you can see the dura mater, the spinal dura mater, it covers a portion of the spinal nerve that leaves the spinal cord. So this portion, for example, the spinal root ganglion and the anterior posterior roots, they're covered by dura mater. And then dura mater stops and the nerve goes out alone, out of the vertebral bone and to the rest of the body. The dura mater does not follow it beyond that. It stays within that vertebral body and just a little bit outside of it perhaps, but then the dura mater will stop, and you will have the anterior primary ramus and posterior primary ramus continuing without the dura mater covering them. Okay. Finally, I just want to tell you one more thing about the spinal cord. So this is the foramen magnum, separating medulla from spinal cord. The spinal cord has two expansions. See here, there's an expansion, and there's an expansion along the bottom before it ends as the conus medullaris. This expansion is called the cervical expansion because it's in the cervical region, and this is called lumbar expansion because it's in the lumbar region. And of course, the conus medullaris is at the level of L1. Okay, so this one is going to be for there's something called the brachial plexus, a whole plexus of nerves that goes to the upper limb, and here lumbar plexus and lumbosacral plexus, a bundle of nerves that go to the lower limb. Okay, so that's why there are those two extensions.